In last week's episode, we began analyzing the Slav defense, and we did then have a quick introduction of the opening, and in this week's episode we'll analyze the exchange variation more thoroughly. The exchange variation is achieved after d4, d5, c4, c6, c takes on d5, and c takes on d5. As I said last week, this variation is known mainly for its prearranged draws, this due to the symmetrical character of the variation which follows. Next step in this variation is to develop the knights. White's knight to c3 is not that odd, but black should be more careful before choosing which knight to develop with. Knight to f6 is the more popular move, but if black instead chooses to play knight to c6, white has an interesting possibility to play e4. If black captures on e4, white answers with d5, leading us to a somewhat dangerously looking position for black. Unfortunately, almost nothing is known about this variation, but most likely black will avoid this line by playing knight to f6 instead of capturing on e4. This transposes the variation to a Caro-Kann after an exchange on d5, followed by knight to f3. White can also try to play e5 instead of exchanging on d5, but after knight to e4 and bishop d3, we have once again reached an uncharted territory. In order to avoid these many variations, black often chooses to play knight to f6 instead of knight to c6. White has now continued his development and does mainly have to choose between bishop to f4 and knight to f3. The only real differences between the two moves is that bishop to f4 is considered just a bit more flexible, but even so, knight to f3 is more common. Now follows black's knight to c6, and after bishop to f4, we have reached the starting point for theory in this line. In our previous episode, I mentioned that black had three choices: bishop to f5, e6, and a6. a6 is the most recent addition to the theory in this line, and the advantages with this move is that it allows the bishop on c8 to develop to g4, a move which has to be played only after white's e3. If black plays bishop to g4 directly, white gets a comfortable position after knight to e5. Because of this, white often tries to postpone his e3 by playing rook to c1 in this position. Even though a6 can seem as a lost move, the pawn on a6 is quite useful. One of the greater advantages with knowing this line is that it can be transposed to from a later exchange on d5 if black plays a6 in the standard lines of the Slav defense. If we return to before a6 and take a look at bishop to f5, we are once again in that symmetrical line, and if white wants to break free from the gloom of an overhanging draw, he should try to play e3, and after black's e6, bishop to b5. White does now threaten to play knight to e5, and more so, to create an awkward pawn on c6 for black, something black defends best against now by playing bishop to knight to d7. White strengthens the pressure on the c6 knight by playing queen to a4, which is followed by black protecting the knight with his rook. White castle kingside, followed by black's a6, a move which leads to an exchange on c6, followed by rook f to c1. White has a small lead in a development, but other than that, the position is equal. Another thing worth mentioning is that white will have a tough time turning his advantage more tangible, but that doesn't mean that the game is doomed to end in a draw. Rather, both sides have brilliant opportunities to fight their opponent on an equal footing. Now we end this week's episode of The Opening School. We'll be back again next week, so see you then.